Okay, so we will begin as people begin to filter in. We will begin our event. So welcome everyone to the Iran 1400 Project's fourth Spotlighting an Author event. Today we will be discussing Professor Fatemeh Shams' new book, A Revolution in Rhyme, Poetic Co-option under the Islamic Republic. It was published this year and it's a great read and I recommend it to everyone. Before we begin with the event, I would like to just take a few minutes to explain the Iran 1400 Project to those who may not be familiar with it. The goal of the Iran 1400 Project is to encourage healthy and productive conversations about Iran, rather than shouting or posturing. The project hopes to make a constructive contribution to understanding Iran and inspires to better interpret Iran's past and present in order to more accurately perceive what Iranians consider a viable future for their country. Our guest today is Professor Fatemeh Shams, who is an acclaimed academic and poet in her own right. Her collection of poetry, When They Broke Down the Door, was awarded the Latifa Yershater Prize in 2016. After receiving her Ph.D. in Oriental Studies at Oxford, she taught Persian language and literature courses at various institutions in the United Kingdom, including Oxford, SOAS, and at the Courtauld Institute of Art. She is currently an assistant professor of Persian literature at the University of Pennsylvania, my alma mater. And I really had I had the pleasure of taking two courses with Professor Shams, one on media and contemporary culture and another on modern Persian literature. Professor Shams was really more of a mentor for me than a professor, who really taught me how to decipher and understand the power behind the written word, and instilled in me a true passion for literature and cultural studies. Her book, A Revolution in Rhyme, is really a groundbreaking study on the co-option and the canonization of poetry under the Islamic Republic in Iran. Unfortunately, this cultural phenomenon has received little to no academic attention prior to this book, and truly we are honored to have her as a guest here today. So before we begin the event and I give the floor to Professor Shams, I would just like to explain the format of the event today. Professor Shams will discuss her book for about 30 minutes, and then we will, then that will be followed by questions from myself and also from our audience. Anyone in the audience can ask questions today. They can either comment in the comment box their questions, or they can email their questions to media@iran1400.org. Also, please check out our website, iran1400.org. We are currently working on lots of different studies about the history of Iran over the course of the past century, whether it be the women's movement, modernism, modernity, and the difference between those, and also poetry. So today, Professor Shams' event is really relevant to what we are doing at our project. And again, before I give the floor to Professor Shams, we will play a short teaser with some quotes from her book. So with no further ado, Professor Shams, the floor is yours, and we are all truly excited to hear about your amazing book, A Revolution in Rhyme. Here it is.
Can you hear me,
yes.
Christian?
Yes.
Yes.
The audio sounds great now. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. It's truly a pleasure to be here today, especially because I'm in conversation with one of my former students. And those of you who are teachers out there, you know how meaningful that is, and how unique really it feels to see your students thriving in the world, and Christian is one of them. It's so good to see you and to be in conversation with you, Christian. I'm really looking forward to your questions. And thank you for making this event a possibility. You and your colleagues at Iran 1400 Project, which I believe is one of the most interesting and really engaging projects that is currently happening in the field of Iranian studies. I would like to extend my gratitude and thanks to Mateen and Tabi and Anbari also for organizing this event. And without further ado, I try to be very brief. I think I have about 25, 30 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes, 30 minutes is great.
Great, 30 minutes. I'll try to lay out some of the ideas of the book, the reason that I wrote this book, and why I wrote this book for the audience. You know, of course, my special thanks to those of you who made the time to be here. I can see many familiar names, friends, mentors. It's really such a pleasure to be here. So thank you. I will, as we are still doing in this crazy world that we are living, share my screen with you. Just 1 second. So can the host please allow me to share my screen, because currently I'm unable to do that.
Yes, Matt, we'll do that. You can try again now to share the screen. Try again now and see if it works.
Okay, wonderful. So it doesn't. Okay, it doesn't allow me to do that. One second. We should have checked this, I guess, before the event, but I don't know why it says allows them to share open your preferences. Okay.
Do you have permission now to share the screen?
I do, but it doesn't. It doesn't allow me for some reason to share my screen. I don't know why. Security.
Yeah, it may just be some issue.
I mean, I can go ahead without really any PowerPoint. It would have been nice to have the PowerPoint, but I can also just go ahead and, you know, give a talk, give an old-fashioned talk. So
without the technology, it's great.
Okay, so you have to bear my face for the next 20, 25 minutes. And I apologize for this technical issue.
Can you try just one more time? Do you mind if just trying one more time, Professor Shams, to see if you can share it now?
Sure. It's you know, it's sort of it goes on the page. It allows me to, but it says that I have to open the system preferences in my computer and then try to. I'm trying to find the Zoom, but yeah, that's why I don't really.
It may be your personal computer that needs to approve to share.
It might be. Also, like, since I've been in Germany, there are all kinds of technical difficulties with my computer.
I understand. Yeah, for sure.
Let me just double check with the video bar and see how it works.
But if you feel comfortable with continuing without the PowerPoint, it's perfectly fine as well.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. So, so yeah, the book, for those of you who have possibly seen it, is called, and as Christian mentioned, the book is called A Revolution in Rhyme, Poetic Co-option under the Islamic Republic. It was published this year, and it has come out of, I mean, the book itself is a product of my personal and professional life really both in and outside Iran. If I would want to sort of summarize the main arguments that I have made in this book, and also the main questions, I would start by saying that this book is about state building and institutionalization of poetry after the 1979 revolution. That really is the core topic of the book. I have tried to explain in this book the role of poetry in state building and also the dissemination of political ideology in the post-revolutionary period. The mechanisms that have been used by the state and by the state officials in the past 4 decades in order to make this possible, this project, which I call Poetic Co-option, and I will explain later what do I mean by that. And I've tried in the book to show how this project, this ideological and political and literary project, relates to a specific type of approach to the literary past. And what, and basically widely and closely looking at the poetic output of the state-sponsored poets in the past 4 decades or 42 years. The book consists of 7 chapters. I have, and it's the sort of the framework is a combination of chronological and thematic sort of approach to this project. It starts by rethinking the Islamic Republican canon and the canon formation and reformation after the revolution. One of the main goals that I have tried to fulfill in this book has been to basically challenge and criticize the binary and episodic approach to the literary history and literary historiography. What do I mean by that? In the past 42 years, basically not a single book has been written on this particular topic. And that has kept me sort of busy in the past 10 years, at least, of my life as a researcher, as a grad student, and later on as sort of an assistant professor. That why has this been the case? Why these poets? Why this literary project has never really received any attention by the scholars of the field? What are the reasons? And how can we problematize this reluctance among the literary historians to address and to study this kind of trend? I try to very briefly answer this question, why? In the book, in the introduction of the book, I deal with this in detail, and I have answered this question. I've tried to problematize and contextualize this lack of attention and gap in the field. One of the reasons has been the lack of physical presence and contact with Iran among the scholars of the Persian literary field. Many of the scholars who were forced to leave Iran and were exiled mainly as a result of the cultural revolution that happened in the 1980s in Iran, have been unable to go back. And this lack of contact with the country, in my view, has created a huge gap, and also to a certain extent, also misunderstanding and lack of knowledge of basically the ongoing change and the ongoing developments in the literary scene and in the official literary scene in particular. The information and the knowledge has been always filtered through headlines and through different ideological sort of filters and channels. And this really has created a serious problem in the field. The problem mainly is sort of emerging from the fact that there has been, and rightly so, invaluable work that has been done in the field by major scholars of the literary studies, Persian literature in particular. I'm talking about modern Persian literature and also medieval Persian literature, but since I'm a modernist, my focus really is on the modern period. The emphasis has been on the resistance and the defiance of the Persian intelligentsia, mostly the former revolutionary period, the pre-revolutionary period, basically. The authors who were at once revolutionary and inspired by the 1979 revolution, and then after the revolution were basically dismayed and disillusioned by the outcome and mostly purged or censored or widely marginalized. And as I mentioned, there amazing work has been done on these poets and writers, on censorship also, but there's been always this persisting gap and lack of scholarship on the conformism and ideology. So one of the goals of this book is to show that how the post-revolutionary generation of scholars who have had the experience of living under the Islamic Republic, going to school under the Islamic Republic, getting educated through the school textbooks, how do they see Iran? And I'm one of them. The Iran-Iraq war generation and the post-war generation. What did they learn in a school, and what does their collective social memory entail as far as poetry and songs and revolutionary songs are concerned? And what is the relationship of these components with ideology and with the state and with the seat of power? I'm always been fascinated with the relationship between power and poetry. And in the book, I try to show that this relationship between poetry and patronage is really distinct and unique when it comes to the Persian literary history. We have a rich poetic past where poets and court poetry was extremely popular and really was the major sort of source for the poets to make their income, and also to create some of the most wonderful poems and literary works that even to this day, the scholars are fascinated by them and study them, very created in the court. So one of the sort of the objectives of this work is to show this continuity rather than rupture since the revolution. One of the problems, in my view, not only in the field of literary studies, but also in other fields, in history, in politics, in economics, and also if you go on Twitter and social media these days, you see that there is this mentality that the 1979 revolution has been a moment of rupture. There has been this world before the revolution and this world after the revolution, and they're completely detached from each other. They have nothing to do with each other. The rulers of the Islamic Republic have nothing in common with their predecessors, and vice versa. And I think that by challenging this mindset and this approach to history and to the humanities and sort of the field, really the field of humanities, whatever our focus is, there are many interesting sort of pathways that open up and sort of emerge in the field where we can do much more creative, research. In this book, I show how this misconception about the official literature or the state-sponsored literature, that this kind of literature only, or poetry in particular, since I'm focused in the book on poetry, how this sort of misunderstanding that this type or this poetic trend only emerged as an after effect of the revolution. It was a poetic trend that never existed. It didn't have any roots in the past. And this is also one of the reasons that scholars have been reluctant to focus on these poets, because they believe that, you know, this past 4 decades of propagandistic literature and poetry has nothing that's worth their time and their attention. And has nothing also to do with this rich literary past. Well, I think, with all due respect, I think this is wrong and misleading to sort of litter and ignore these poets and their work, because I truly believe, and I show in the book, how they are engaged very consciously, so as you also saw in the teaser, with the past, and which parts of this literary past has been selectively chosen, not only by these poets, but also by the state ideological apparatus, by the 2 leaders of the Islamic Republic, Ruhollah Khomeini and Sayyid Ali Khamenei, who are both poets in their own right, whether or not we like their poetic output. They're fascinated, were and are fascinated by poetry. Ali Khamenei, still to this day, even during the Corona time, they had their poetic sort of poetry ceremonies, annual poetry ceremonies, and he takes it very seriously. He very much likes to be sort of centered and also seen and perceived as not only a political leader, but also as a poet and a literary critic. He makes it very clear every year that poetry and words and Persian language as one of 2 pillars of the Islamic Republic and ideology, and the other pillar being Islam, matter to him, and how reforming the Persian language through poetry and disseminating the ideology and the values of the Islamic Republic through verse is extremely critical and important to him. So we cannot, for those of us who are dealing with modern Iran, we cannot simply ignore this dimension and this aspect of the political leadership in today's Iran. So speaking of the episodic approach, in the book, I have tried to show that how we can find these similar patterns, the relationship between the poets with the seat of power since 10th century to this day, and how this has evolved over time. I'm not claiming that what we have today is court poetry. That's one of the misunderstandings that unfortunately has, been very common since this book has come out. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is to show how, and this has been done in the book through a very multidisciplinary theoretical approach, through theories from political science and theories from psychoanalysis and also from literary criticism. I have tried to show how certain traditions such as court poetry that existed in the past and also return to a specific historical past, as we saw during the very last years of Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi's reign, where he called himself the son of Aryan race, or the Arya-Mehr, all the way to Ruhollah Khomeini, who called himself an idol breaker, going back to Ibrahim, and sort of, trying to focus on a completely different, or shifting the historical direction from this pre-Islamic Zoroastrian past that was very much the focus of the secular nationalist project of the pre-revolutionary Muhammad Reza Shah period, all the way to the return to an Islamic past. And I have shown in the book, it starts in the introduction, all the way to the very last chapter of the book, that how this political approach is in fact shown and displayed. It also is very much present in the poetry, the poetic output of the pre and post-revolutionary period. One of the major arguments that I make in the book is that this poetic trend doesn't come out, or hasn't come out after the revolution, hasn't come out of the revolution. So there is no sort of cause and effect relationship between revolution and literature in general, in my view. I think that, and I show in the book how Islam as a political discourse, as an ideology of resistance, was used in fact by poets who had nothing to do with sort of the Islamist groups. It was very common among poets with leftist tendencies, but some members of the Kanun Navissandegان or the Writers Association. In fact, the first poet who called Khomeini by the title of Imam was Ne'mat Mirzazadeh, who was a poet that was very much closer to the leftist poets of the Writers Association. And you know, those of you who are familiar with the pre-revolutionary period perhaps recall the last words of Post-Revolutionary trial, when he, you know, went back and sort of recalled Hussein, Imam Hussein, and his sort of crusade and jihad and war against injustice. So we see this before the revolution, and of course we see this among those poets of the first generation of this particular poetic trend that I study in the book, those who were around before the revolution, such as Musavi Garmarudi, Tahereh Safarzadeh, Ali Muallim, Hamid Sabzawari, and so forth. And then we see this also in the post-revolutionary period, of course, with those poets that in the wake of the revolution, when they basically started their professional literary sort of career around the time of the revolution. And these are the poets that I call in the book as the second generation. And I think this is a very important sort of contribution to the field of it. This book tries to show how by focusing on continuities, we can change our approach and our understanding of the literary evolution and also the developments and changes in the literary history without being just ideologically focused and sort of single-minded, and by reducing literature and literary production to political events. And at the same time, having said that, I think it's very important to see and understand the ways in which Islam itself, the meaning of Islam itself, has changed from a political discourse of resistance to a ruling ideology. And again, if we look at the way that the Islamic Republic has tried in the past 4 decades to redefine a new literary genre, or to define it in its own way. The literature of the Islamic Revolution, unfortunately, my PowerPoint didn't work, but I had one of the pages of the school textbooks to show you, like, the high school literature textbook, basically the 10th grade, for those of you who would like to go and check. Adabiyat Enqilab Islami, which comes in the Gune Shanasi, or the typology of the sort of the literary trends, and the literature of the Islamic Revolution, literature of the Islamic Revolution. So that episodic approach, that dangerous episodic approach, on the other side of the spectrum, is promoted by the state itself. And that's why I think it's very important for us scholars to break away from this binary approach. And, you know, according to these school textbooks, this body of literature, and I quote, includes poems and writings that have been produced since the victory of the revolution. The themes of such works include Islamic culture, Imam Hussein's revolt, Khomeini's thought, and the cultural and spiritual qualities of the revolutionary society. You can see how occasional this, to borrow my wonderful mentor and colleague who's also here, Dr. Ahmad Karimi Haqqaq. He has a wonderful article on the occasional poetry and literature after the revolution, the rise of it, of course, it existed in the past, the rise of that, the revival of it. And you can see that this sort of occasional topical literature was very much part of this literary project, this view of approach to poetry and literature. And I think this is very important for us to see how the meaning of Islam and the position of Islam also changes in the pre and the post-revolutionary period. And I try also to show how this approach to Islam is very much closely, intimately tied with the literary tradition. So I had a video to share with you, which basically shows this act of co-optation or familiarizing the new, or the reification of the aesthetics, poetic aesthetics, of course, I mean here, of the past. That's what I mean by co-optation, that these poets took things that existed in the past and used it for a distinct ideological purpose. A great example is one of the major, revolutionary songs that again, Dr. Karimi Haqqaq has written also about this. And I urge everyone to read it. And in fact, those lines for me, which are his memories, his vivid memories of those days of revolution, the early days of revolution, for me was one of the major sources of inspiration to write this book. Since you can't see the video, I think the audio also helps for those of you who understand Persian. For those of you who don't understand, this is a famous revolutionary song written by Hamid Sabzawari, one of the poets that I study in the book. And he uses some lines of the 14th century poet, a couple of verses from one of the famous sonnets, ghazals of Hafiz Shirazi, arguably the most famous and most popular poet, Persian poet to this day. He uses that in reference, but with a distinct ideological purpose and with a specific reference to Ayatollah Khomeini. And the line is, when the demon leads, the angel arrives. Div cho birun ravat, fereshte darayad. I will just play that part of the song for those of you who, so at least we have some audio experience with the material that I have included in the book.
So
familiar.
Sorry, I'm just changing to my.
And Professor Shams, you can share this video with us later and with Martin, and he will send it to all the participants of the event today. That way everyone can see the visual.
Yeah, I can also probably send some slides so they can, have a idea about the content also, if needed. I can certainly do that, no problem.
That would be great.
But the parts that you heard, for those of you who don't understand Persian, the part that I played for you basically were lines from Hafiz Shirazi. And one might ask, what do lines from a very famous ghazal by a 14th century poet do in the middle of a revolutionary song that was made in 1979 upon the arrival of the exiled cleric from Paris? Well, that's basically the core of this book. I try to show, and I think this is the best example, and many other examples that I show in the book, acts of co-optation. You take things from the past and then you redefine them and sort of represent them for a different purpose or a different objective. I'll keep it very I'll try to keep it brief here, and I have a couple of more minutes. So I studied 10 poets in this book, as I mentioned. I divide them into 2 different generations, and I show through their life and also through their literary career how these poets evolved. And I also show that, although these poets were quote unquote conformist and sponsored by the state, they also had their poetic individuality. It's, this sort of black and white idea of, because this poet was close to this particular ideological belief system, they're completely like, that we should not study them, we should just stay away from them and all of that. They're not real poets and so forth. So I argue against this black and white picture. And I show that these poets did not remain the same. Each of them were distinct individuals, very different from each other, though they also had a lot in common. During the wartime, how they used this particular literary past that was basically and also sort of which was the mystical tradition, and how they used that for their own distinct purpose. How drunkenness and sama, or the whirling, that sort of the mystical whirling, was used as a way to represent or cover the bloody and the violent face of death in the field, or martyrdom, or the ideology of martyrdom. How poetry, and particularly mystical poetry and mystical themes, helped to create this poetic violence during the war. But then many of these poets, including Hassan Hosseini, including Qaisar Aminpour, or Muhammad Reza Malikian, they gradually very disillusioned by who they were and what they wrote. And one of these poets, Qaisar Aminpour, months before his death, actually had an interview where, he was awarded as the national war poet of Iran by the government. But then after the war, and towards the late 1990s, he started writing poems for peace. He has 3 pieces, 3 poems called Poems for Peace. And also he said in an interview that, I wish I've never written those poems, meaning poems of war. So, and then go and read my poems for peace. And I think this is very important. It's important to include all of these different and sort of sometimes even paradoxical and opposing views of these poets, in order to complicate really the page. It's very easy to always start from one point and end and have a destination when we do research, and to just be quite linear and binary in our understanding of history and human beings and poetry and literature in particular. And I think by including all these different pieces of puzzle, we just simply make history and literary history much more interesting, and sort of this difference in the way, the dynamic of change, how from one decade to the next, we see that this dynamism, this social and political dynamism also changes. I finish by saying that this story of poetry and power in Iran, in today's Iran, is very much ongoing. I say this, I have stated this in the final chapter of the book also, that as I ended and I closed the book, there are many poets inside Iran. I would like to name Baktash Abtin in particular, who was chained to his hospital bed a few weeks ago, a member of Kanun Navissandeghan. I would like to mention Ismail Khoi's name, who died in exile after many years of suffering, not being able to go back home. And of course, Mukhtari and Puyande, who were victims of chain murders of the secular intellectuals during 1990s, and many more poets, and poets such as young poets such as Fatemeh Shams, Mehdi Musavi, who had to flee Iran during the past couple of years after receiving harsh sentences just for writing poetry. So that's one sort of face of this side of this coin. Another side of the coin are the ongoing annual ceremonies led by Khamenei himself, and many poets who are constantly being trained, and they're joining this camp of sort of conformist sponsored poets by the state. Many of them, such as Alireza Qazeh, who I study in the book, or Mohammad Reza Amiri Sandaqeh, these are poets who are very close to Khamenei. They have official posts and positions in the region, such as Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. And Ali Khamenei's literary project is very much closely tied to his political project. He has poets who are Arab speaking, who are Turkish speaking, Azeri poets, Russian poets, Urdu speaking poets. He wants to show, even if it's just a project in front of, sort of a show, a very well engineered, well put together show, he wants to, television show, I mean, he wants to emphasize on the fact that Iran is not his only territory. He very much has this mindset of medieval sultans who, considered themselves to be sort of the king of way more than what their territory was, their defined territory was. And, that very well could be explained and understood and analyzed by Eric Hobsbawm's theory, Invention of Tradition, which I have used in the book extensively. It can show that, every single time he gives a talk, he makes sure to distinguish himself from the former rulers of Iran, calling them corrupt and, power thirsty and this and that. I mean, he does the exact same thing under a completely different, of course, outlook, but the core idea is the same, which I call invention of the traditions in the book, and I try to explain that. So I end here. These are my final remarks. I'm very sorry that I couldn't share with you some poems that I prepared. I'll happily circulate them later if anyone was interested. Or alternatively, you can read the book, which is full of poems with English translation. So thank you for bearing with me. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Professor Shams. It was excellent. And if you would like to share your PowerPoint and the video with Martin, maybe we can share it now if there's anything else you would like to explain about the book.
Sounds great. I'll do that.
Now the chat box is open for questions from our audience. If anybody wants to ask a question, you can drop a question here. Thank you so much. I just like to start with a question of my own, if that's okay. And I read your book and it was completely fascinating, and I recommend it to anyone who is interested in Iranian studies or poetry at large. one of the things that we are investigating at the Iran 1400 project is the issue of identity. And in your chapter on official poets, you mentioned the poet Tahereh Safarzadeh, and how one could argue that her placement in this official canon of poets of the Islamic Republic could be a form of tokenization of sorts, given that she is one of the few women, if not the only woman, to receive official acclaim and recognition. I wanted to ask you, considering her and also just the official poets at large, if identity, gender, ethnic, regional, or otherwise, was a consideration for the placement of these official poets in the canon of the Islamic Republic poetry.
Yes, thank you for the wonderful question, which actually gives me the opportunity to maybe elaborate a little bit on those aspects that I didn't have the time to talk about. This is one of the questions actually that have come up in the past discussions around the book, that why do we have only one? Why did you include only one woman poet in this canon? That's a very good question. And the very simple answer to that question is that because there are only so many, women poets that actually made it to the core of this canon. It is a highly masculine, male-dominated canon to begin with. And I argue that in the book, that why is it like that? And why, for example, Tahereh Safarzadeh becomes so important to the Islamic Republic to be, included in the school textbooks, to be given the title of Khadim al-Quran, or the servant of Quran, after her translation of Quran into English. One of the major, the very straightforward answer to your question is that yes, identity very much matters. It's very much an identity-based. This canon itself is very much focused on identity politics, right? As much as we want to focus on the gray area, that religion is not everything, and it's not the whole picture, and religion itself should be kind of discussed, and we have to explain what do we mean by that. But the reality and the truth of the matter is that Islam and Islamic identity was extremely important to the leaders of the Islamic Republic and to the officials. And after the revolution, those who showed more, religious tendencies, they received much more attention and they're embraced by the state. And that's a real fact. I mean, we can't really talk about Iran and then constantly pretend that religion is not a dividing factor, because it is. And it's very much the government itself that creates this binary. As much as we want to break away from the binary, this Islam versus secularism, I think, it is a real is part of the reality of today's life in Iran. And for a poet like Tahereh Safarzadeh, I think it was very important for the revolutionaries and revolutionary intelligentsia to include a woman like her, in order to put her up against other poets, such as Forough Farrokhzad in particular, and to a large extent also Simine Behbahani. Those are the poets who have been widely read and extremely popular, much more than Tahereh Safarzadeh, one could argue. But the government, and particularly in the Second Republic, right after the death of Khomeini and with the rise of Khamenei to power, I think he is the one who is extremely conscious of the fact that we do need a female poet in order to represent her as a perfect model of a woman poet. This woman has to be modest, has to represent those ideals of the revolution, including wearing hijab and writing poetry that is face conscious. And Tahereh Safarzadeh has all of that, had all of those criteria, right? So she was a perfect example and a perfect replacement, especially for those two poets that I named, Forough Farrokhzad and and Tahereh Safarzadeh and Simone Behbahani. And on top of that, she was a good poet. And I think that really played an important role, made the task of the government much easier to justify her as a sort of a representative of this canon, a female representative of this canon. I hope I answered your question.
No, very much so. It was a great answer. And identity did play an important role in this canon, in the construction of this canon. I wanted to ask a question from our audience. Just a question about, could you please repeat the names of the poets that you covered in the book?
Yes, and thank you for that, for that question, because I actually didn't have the time to go through that, and I thought maybe during the Q&A we could talk about it. So 10 poets, as I mentioned: مهرزاد اوستا، طاهره صفارزاده، محمد رضا عبدالملکیان، حمید سبزواری، علی معلم، علیرضا قزوه، محمد رضا امیری اسفندقه، حسن حسینی، قیصر امینپور و سلمان هراتی. And as I mentioned, I have divided them into 2 categories, and I have basically used the model or the sort of the framework that the Afghan literary critic Mohammad Kazem Kazemi, who's also a poet himself, he has written a book about 10 poets of the revolution, although he hasn't actually, he doesn't mention Muhammad Reza Amiri Esfandaqeh in that book. I introduced him as one of the sort of the younger generations that, to show that the sort of this canon is very much evolving, and it's not just one canon of 10 poets. And also I mentioned in the introduction of the book that by no means I mean that there are only these 10 poets who belong to this canon. There are many other poets, actually, such as Yusuf Ali Mir Shakak, that I discuss in the book. His role was very important in sort of discrediting major poets such as Ahmad Shamlu, to defame, he had this defamation project for many years during 1980s, where he basically, his main duty was to defame poets such as Ahmad Shamlu and Mehdi Akhavan Sales and so forth. So there are other poets who are very important in my view. But again, in one book, you can't really cover everything. And I really hope that this book opens the ground for further inquiries and sort of research in the field. I think it's at least that's my hope, that it opens the discussion and more work will be done.
For sure.
On other poets.
I will ask another question from our audience. So, did you find evidence of the Supreme Literary Committee already understanding this role of poetry in promoting ideology or forming a political order before the revolution, when he was a participant and imprisoned, etc.?
Wonderful question. Thank you. Yes, actually, a lot of that. And there was a biography that came out right before the book was published. Right before I finished sort of the book, which I have used extensively in the book, actually. And I show that, because many critics who are reluctant to work on these poets, and particularly to consider Khamenei and his interest for poetry as an important matter, as an important part of his political project, they're reluctant to actually acknowledge this. But if they look into the history of Khamenei's life, which I have in the book, in the final chapter of the book, there is a section where I show the evolution of Khamenei himself in the pre and post-revolutionary period, how he started as a bookworm and then how he became sort of a poetry-loving dictator, right, over time. So, and I show this sort of transformation during his imprisonment, of course, before that also. And, his very close and intimate connection with certain poets of the guerrilla movement, the guerrilla poets, also his close friendship with some members of Kanun Nevisandegan, Writers Association. Most of the members of the Writers Association during his leadership have been prosecuted or killed, such as Mukhtari and Puyande, with whom also he had some kind of friendship before the revolution. So there is a lot there, right, in terms of the personal relationship between Khamenei and some of these poets, as well as his own interest and fascination by poets such as Tahereh Safarzadeh and Indian style of poetry, quote unquote, Sabke Hindi, which again I show in the book why he's fascinated by certain poets for his own moral project, moral literary project, or projet adabi akhlaqi or akhlaqi adabi. I hope I answered your question.
Great, thank you. And also, we're aware of the time. Our event was supposed to last 1 hour. Professor Shams, are you fine with continuing with a few more questions for another 10 minutes or so?
I can see there is one more question.
Yes, from the audience, but any of our audience members who have some circumstances where they must leave, it is fine. We will send you, of course, the link of the full Q&A session later. So our next question is there no cause and result relationship between the revolution and poetry? I think the revolution brought about changes in the themes.
Sure. I mean, yes, I do believe that there is no cause and effect relationship between revolution and poetry for reasons that I have elaborated. What do I mean by that is that we can't really say, and this is not only about the context, the Iranian context. I think this is something we can apply to any other context. You look at Bolshevik Russia, you look at any other country, Mussolini's Italy, you see that there are trends in the pre-revolutionary period that are very much continuing after the revolution, though they're evolving, right? And that's why I'm using the word co-optation here. The manipulation, co-optation, is that showing that continuity and change at the same time. And let's not forget, change and rupture are two different things. So when we say change, it means that something has continued to become something else, or has transformed to something else, which implies a certain kind of or certain type of continuity, of course. And that's what I am concerned with in this book, to show that there are many themes. There has been change. Of course, there has been change. And I show those changes. There has been sometimes dramatic changes, in fact, in the themes that we have mentioned. But those changes, those themes didn't come out of nowhere. They exist in the tradition. We see the mystical literature, mystical poetry have been co-opted during the war. We see the genre of elegy or Marsiyeh being revived during the time when Khomeini died. We have more than 350 elegies just published in one single book. After he died, we see that Khomeini's poems, actually, and Khamenei's poems, in fact, are very much influenced by poets such as Hafiz, Bidil, Tahereh Safarzadeh, and so forth. So we can't really say that there is a cause and effect, that because revolution happened, this particular trend showed up. Of course, it was to a certain extent sponsored and supported by the revolution, but it also existed before the revolution. It just came to the fore in a much more visible, vivid way.
Great. Our next question will be, do you see eulogists, Madak, continue to use poetry as a vehicle to propagate the Nizam's narrative? Again,
excellent question. Thank you. I mean, these are all giving me the chance to talk about certain parts of the book that I didn't have the time to talk about. Yes, the answer to the question is yes, very much so. In fact, I don't know if you're aware, Mr. or Miss Lafa, is that one of the very interesting, in my view, and fascinating developments after the revolution, particularly in the past decade or so, has been the formation of schools, certain schools and universities for the eulogists. So meaning they just go to school in order to study eulogy and become a eulogist, become a maddah, مدارس مداحی و دانشکده مداحی. And Khamenei, after the first decade that he had his poetry nights, now he has a different, separate poetry nights that are being held specifically for the maddah, for the eulogists. He gave a different talk. His performance, the content of his talk is mostly actually focused on the devotional poetry. And then if you also look at devotional poetry, I mean, again, devotional poetry is something that if we go back to the advent of Islam, to this day, we see that devotional poetry has been one of the major trends, right? Both in Arab and Persian speaking world. And during the war, perhaps if you are as old as I am, you remember Sadegh Ahangaran, of course. And there are many other Haj Ali Karimin, many other, their name escaped me, but right now. But there are many other eulogists who are to this day who actually used poetry. And again, in the chapter on the war chapter in the book, I actually discuss the role of Sadegh Ahangaran in particular during the war. In the co-optation of Persian poetry and Persian rhyme also, and the sort of the Persian literary devices into eulogies, and they were extremely effective and very important to inspire the youth to actually join the battlefield, to the point that he became known under the title that actually Iraqi forces used this for the first time. As Khomeini's Nightingale, as a title for Sadegh Ahangaran, for actually, being a maddah and using Persian poetry. So yeah.
Great. Our next question, yes. Thank you for your response. Given your response, we may conclude that the revolution of poetry can be considered a genre which adopts the mechanics of poetry from the past and put it in a new context. I think that's very much a central point of your book. Yes.
And and let's just be careful with the title revolutionary, right? Adjective. Sorry, Christian, I'm just being very quick about this, because I mentioned in the book, revolutionary poetry is a term that you can also use for the literary output of the guerrilla poets of the 1970s. And also many poems that Ahmad Shamlu and Ismail Khoyi and Mehdi Akhavan Saleh wrote actually in support of the revolution, right before the revolution, and also in the wake of the revolution. Sher Enqelabi, those were also Sher Enqelabi or revolutionary poetry. The definition that you basically gave here, which I think is perfect, could be any type of ideologically charged political poetry. They all take themes and genres and devices of the past and then use them for a distinct political purpose. So thank you for wrapping it up. Appreciate that.
Yeah, actually, so a next question. Are you okay with answering about a few more questions? Yes. We got some great questions coming in. So this was actually a question that came to my mind while I was reading your book, especially the initial chapters. I was wondering how you developed the term Islamic Republic poetry, and you kind of discussed this a bit in relation to the last comment. What exactly is Islamic about it, and what is Republican? And also, you mentioned the term throughout the book, committed art and literature. Could you please explain a bit on how this term especially was co-opted from leftist literary terminology by these official republics of the Islamic Republic?
Yeah, wonderful questions. So in regards to your first question, Islamic Republican is one term, is one sort of phrase, not two phrases. So it's not Islamic and Republican, but Islamic Republican, which is basically which translates to She'r Jumhuriye Islami. If you recall in the introduction of the book, I have a section in which I actually explain what do I mean by official literature or adabiyat rasmi, as we translate that to Persian. And in that section, page 14 up to 17 of the book, I explain why do I use the term and why do I prefer the term Islamic Republican over Islamist or Islamic or revolutionary or committed poetry, because I find those other titles quite misleading, and you can put many other different, categories of poetry under those categories, and still make sense. This is a distinct. What I'm trying to show in this book is that as much as it has in common with other literary trends, poetic trends, it's also a distinct literary trend. And the reason I'm using the Islamic Republican as a title, as sort of an adjective here, is precisely because I'm focusing on the sources of support, the state-oriented or state-funded literature. So the role of the state becomes extremely important. And the shadow case in the book, which I forgot to mention during my talk, the shadow case in this book is Soviet Russia. And I have tried in the book to show how much in common these two contexts, how much they have in common, really. If we look at the role of ideology, dissemination of ideology, the role of poetry, the Stalinist sort of approach and mindset to engineering the soul, or writers as the engineers of the soul, those are the terms that you can actually find in early revolutionary period in the state-funded, sort like literary platform. So I'm using this term Islamic Republican as a form of official literature, which existed elsewhere in the world in the past, right? In the book, I give the example in China, in Soviet Russia, in North Africa, Italy under Mussolini, although I don't really go into details about any of these, but which I hope really to do with my, as one of my projects in the future, that how the use of language and literature to legitimize the sort of this authoritarian control throughout history has been important and has repeated elsewhere. And the fact that we see it in Iran, it doesn't mean that it's just specific and unique to Iran. And I think the term official literature and Islamic Republican literature as a connection, sort of connecting term to that theoretical concept, helps us to put Iran on the map, global map, which I think is very important. One of the pitfalls of the Iranian studies field, I think, and this doesn't just it's not limited only to poetry, it can be applied to any other field really, is that we just study ourselves and we are interested in just seeing what happened in Iran, 1953 and so forth, the 1979 revolution. I think really the time has come for us to go a little more beyond Iranian borders and see what was happening around the world before, after, and at the time of the revolution. And I think this is a great example of, literature and ideology is a great example of a common and similar pattern that we have seen elsewhere in the world. And I think those cases really are inspiring and helpful in understanding and contextualizing the Iranian situation. In terms of the term ta'ahud or commitment, which is, I think, very important, and one of the terms that have been really used over and over again, still being used by the leader of the Islamic Republic, by the poets who write in favor of the state, that they call themselves committed poets, sha'aran muta'ahid. It's really fascinating because if you go back to the pre-revolutionary period, and even after the revolution, especially during the 1980s, even to this day, there are some poets of leftist tendencies and also poets who of secular leanings that also consider themselves as committed poets. In fact, they were the ones who used that term for the first time and defined it and considered sort of this idea of ta'ahud or commitment to be sort of the duty of the poet and the writer to be engaged with his social setting, right? with the political events, and not to be detached from the society. This was a really heated debate during 1960s and 1970s in Iran. And we have writers such as Jalal al-Ahmad, Ghulam Hossein Saedi. We have, poets like Ahmad Shamlou in particular had a really important role in the notion of, sort of the evolution of the notion of ta'ahud in the poetic scene. And then we see that concept being sort of borrowed and then redefined and revisited in the post-revolutionary period by Khomeini himself, and also by poets and writers who wrote, with the same ideological alignment. So again, I think it's a great example. The concept of commitment is a great example of co-optation. And the co-optation is not only literary, right? There was a very famous slogan during 1980s that ta'ahud is more important than tahassus, meaning commitment is more important than professionalism. And based on that one slogan, many scholars in universities, many doctors, actually surgeons, many people in the Air Force, actually, they were all purged because their professionalism overweighed their commitment, like revolutionary commitment, of course, ideological commitment. So, and the meaning of commitment, of course, changed, although it was still very much the same idea of offering service to the public and being engaged with politics, but to hold a specific ideological belief, which was promoted by the state. That really was at the core of the new meaning of commitment, and also to be sort of a true and genuine follower of Islam, and to be a good Muslim became also part. So the religious component also became really important in the co-optation of commitment.
Great, thank you so much. Do you have time for about a few more questions?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Because we have some. So this question is based on your experience, obviously, as an academic, as a poet in your own right, and as an observer of the politics, the culture, and the situation of Iran. So one of the main goals of the Iran 1400 project is to look at the evolution of ideas and institutions during the past 100 years, and also hearing from experts and Iranian people's wishes for the next century. Your book, which we discussed today, mostly deals with state-sponsored poetry. And it is no secret that the concept or the idea of freedom is something that Iranian people have been grappling with over the past century. As a former student and as someone who's interested in your perspective, I'd like to know what you think about the role of poetry in exploring the idea of freedom in Iran. Has poetry played any role in it?
Oh, it's a wonderful question, and I think a whole book could be written on this.
Sure.
On this idea, really, and yes, there is a very intimate and close relationship between poetry and freedom, and it's the main manifestation of this idea really comes around a century ago in the rise of the constitutional revolution, which, if you recall, we actually covered in one of our classes, and actually both classes. Like the idea of freedom, independence, the idea of individual autonomy. It really is not an exaggeration to say that poets and writers and journalists of the constitutional era, as far as the modern poetry, of course, literature is concerned, were really the main pioneers of writing and promoting the idea of freedom or azadi in their work. And so the entry to this concept, to the idea of freedom in the modern period, starts with poetry, starts with the poetic output of poets such as Bahar, De Khoda, the newspapers such as Rafil, No Bahar, and you name it, and then many other writers who, the next generation, really the idea of freedom itself in poetry, meaning to break away from the rhyme and the strict conventions, literary poetic conventions such as qafiya, rhyme, radif, refrain, meter, razm, and so forth, right? Which really was the main pioneers of that were the constitutionalist poets. Although we consider Mimayushij as the founder or the father of modern Persian poetry, but really like this idea of freeing oneself from the rhyme and rhythm started in the constitutional revolution by poets such as Mirzadeh Ishqi or Tasnif's songs by Aref Ghazvini. So this is and Lahuti. These are very important factors to keep in to kind of refresh our memory that the idea of freedom and poetry and literature in the Iranian context are extremely interconnected. Maybe another good example is France, and the way in which poetry and literature played such an important role. But I would say even more so in the case of Iran. And it's not a coincidence that poets such as Farrokhi Yazdi threw their mouths in prison in protest to Reza Shah's cruelty and killed in prison, right? Or we have other poets coming later after the constitutional poets, particularly I start the book, as you know, by the 1950, the aftermath of the 1953 coup. And I show how this lack and crisis of freedom for poets and writers, this sort of mass detention, arrests, and persecution of poets and writers really became one of the major triggers of the revolution in 1979. So they are very much intertwined. And also in the post-revolutionary period, as I mentioned at the end of my talk, we still struggle with the idea of freedom of speech, with censorship, again, which is in a way very much connected with the idea of poetry and freedom, language itself, and the self-censorship, right? If you decide not to self-censor, then what do you do as an author? What is your choice? Do you remain silent? Do you write differently, or do you leave? There are three different options in front of you. And those poets who not decided to leave, but had to leave or had to stay outside, like myself, we do struggle on a day-to-day basis with the idea of freedom and poetry, and that to what extent, you pay the cost for what you write. And so it's a serious matter, and it's a serious problem, I would say, that we still grapple with to this day.
And I wanted to ask, that was a great response. And I think also as a former student, we did cover a lot of these poets and these ideas in your courses. And I remember you really emphasized the idea of freedom, of autonomy. And as I said in your introduction, really understanding the power behind the written word. Before taking your courses, I really didn't understand that a poet could be more than just some flowery speech or some rhyme, that actually there could be some real meaning to it, real political and real social meaning. So that's something I'm very appreciative of from you. I just, thank you. I just wanted to ask one last question, if I may, and it concerns I believe it's your third chapter in the book, and it discusses the motif of the village in Persian poetry. And personally, I found this chapter very fascinating, because here I think I found the most direct co-option of the poets, the official poets of the Islamic Republic, with the leftist poets prior to the 1979 revolution. Could you just maybe discuss that a bit about this and how they changed this motif from something that was supposed to bring to light some of the downtrodden people of the country, the issues of rapid urbanization, to showing images of, wow, these villages are beautiful, we should respect the people of the villages?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I can surely discuss that very briefly. Hopefully I won't spoil the book for everyone. Thus far I haven't. And if I have, I apologize. But these are wonderful questions. And I think, the sort of the portrayal of the village, as you mentioned, has undergone really interesting and fascinating transformations over the past 4 decades and before that. So in that chapter, which is basically the 3rd chapter of the book, is in front of me now. I show how the village as a symbol has been sort of a conduit into which the ideology can be poured before and after the revolution. Again, I think this is one of the ways to focus and emphasize on the continuity rather than rupture, right? And co-optation. So I start in the chapter by basically showing that how this sort of political motive for village was used as in relation to the political motive for nostalgia, and how this nostalgia for this ideal life, which again is not specific to Iranian context, right? I have shown in the book that, for example, Raymond Williams, the British scholar, has this wonderful book called The Country and the City that was published in 1973, in which he actually showed that this rural world has been continually and systematically altered in ways that sort of stem from and contribute to the development of the capitalist economy. He discusses in the book, and I just read from the chapter. And I show that how this is also the case in the Iranian context. How in the pre-revolutionary period we have this moment of sort of a literary response to the White Revolution project, right? The Shah's White Revolution project, where we have writers such as Ghulam Hossein al-Saidi, Jalal al-Ahmad, and many other writers, or Ibrahim Golestan, in fact. They made movie, Dariush Mehdi made this movie Cow that, pleased Khomeini, and like many other writers who wrote about villages. And they started this ethnographical sort of survey on remote villages in Iran, their rituals, their customs for the first time as part of the literary output. And again, this is very much the case in the Soviet Russia. There were many poets and writers who actually wrote in the late 19th century, 20th century. I think it's a fascinating parallel if you look at the Soviet literary history. In this chapter, I show how this idea of, in the pre-revolutionary period, of course, using this peasantry life or the peasant as sort of this devastated character whose life and whose cows and farm have been taken away from him, and sort of is a way to criticize the sort of the fast pace of the modernization process, the modernization project of the late Pahlavi state. Whereas in the post-revolutionary period, we see that also in the post-revolutionary period, we see that we have this continuation again in the use of the village motif in literature. What is fascinating about the post-revolutionary period is that Khomeini himself uses the village motif not only in his political sort of ideology, but also in his public speeches. And he also has this very rural accent also, right? He has an accent that is very familiar, intimate, close, relatable to ordinary folks. And using this downtrodden he comes up with new concepts, with new words inspired by the Quranic text, by Quran, such as Mustaz'afin, Pa Barahneghan, which is also not from Quran, of course, but using the terms such as Mustaz'af or rural Rushdai as being the main owners of the revolution, and then having the agricultural crusade, Jahad Keshavarzi, of course, that happens during the 1980s, which is basically a plan to develop and develop the villages. And I mentioned in this chapter that political economists have discussed of Iran, such as Jawad Salehi Esfahani, that how the revolution actually helped villages to make progress in that sort of agricultural lifestyle that was very much troubled as a result of the modernization project of the Shah. So it's really, again, it's not a black and white. It's a more complicated, picture, right? And that's why I have the dark and bright side of village as the subtitle for the chapter, because again, there are positive and negative aspects. There are good and bad intertwined. And as far as, again, you see, as far as the literature of the war is concerned, you see that the image or the persona of the soldier is very much connected to this rural background. There are many rural soldiers who are coming and joining the war and becoming martyrs. And this becomes part of the children literature of the time, interestingly enough. I show how in this sort of period, this village motif in Persian literature changes into something completely different and distinct from, let's say, garden or bagh or golestan, rose garden of the medieval period, but still very much is connected with it. It's a very modern concept, but at the same time, it creates a binary versus the city as far as the Islamic Republican poetry is concerned, which is, again, important. The city becomes the place of disillusionment, and village becomes this nostalgic space, this that represents the ideal good life that everyone should return to. And this is, again, part of the Return to the Roots project that was part of the pre-revolutionary projects of people such as Jalal al-Ahmad, of course. Again, there is the continuity, I think, in the political ideology of returning to the self and to the roots and to authenticity, and village become the representation of that in the poetry.
Very great discussion. Thank you so much, Fatemeh Shams, Professor Fatemeh Shams, for your time and for discussing your book. The book is titled A Revolution in Rhyme, and I recommend everyone go get a copy of it wherever they can. It's very fascinating, and as I said in the introduction, a truly groundbreaking study on these official poets of the Islamic Republic. I thank you for joining us. And just to wrap up, I welcome everyone again to the Iran 1400 project. Please check out our website, iran1400.org. You can follow us also on social media, whether it be Facebook, Instagram, and we also have a very active Twitter account. We also are recording podcasts in English, and you can find our podcast basically wherever you hear your podcast, whether it be Apple or Spotify. And if you are interested in participating in the project, please reach out to us on our website. So thank you so much for joining us all today. It truly was a pleasure, and I think we had a great conversation with Professor Shams.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Christian. It was such a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for these wonderful questions. Really, I'm really moved to see how engaged the audience was, and how much how carefully you read the book, Christian. Thank you. This means a lot to me. It's the best that an author can wish for.
Thank you. I learned close reading from you.
Thank you. It's good to see you, and thank you, everyone, for being here and for bearing with me. And thank you, Tabby, for everything. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. Great.